Ray Dalio stared at the climate economic modeling report spread across his desk, his hands trembling as he processed the implications of what he was reading. It was 3:17 a.m. at Bridgewater Associates, and what he had discovered would either save capitalism from itself or confirm the most devastating economic collapse in human history. The document was a classified analysis from multiple climate research institutions, detailing how extreme weather events were accelerating beyond all previous projections. But this wasn't just an environmental report. Ray's economic modeling showed that climate change was creating systemic financial risks that would make capitalism mathematically impossible by 2030, with over $200 trillion in global assets hanging in the balance. Ray had been working on this analysis for 6 months, initially as a study of agricultural commodity investments. What he discovered was far more terrifying than market volatility. Climate change wasn't just an environmental crisis, it was an economic extinction event that would destroy the foundation of free market capitalism within the next 5 years. The first indication of the crisis had come 4 months earlier when Bridgewater's agricultural portfolios began experiencing impossible losses. Wheat futures that should have been profitable were devastated by simultaneous droughts in 3 major grain-producing regions. Insurance companies were quietly exiting entire geographic markets. Supply chains that had operated for decades were permanently breaking down. Ray's personal experience with the crisis had been devastating. His family's 200-acre Connecticut property, purchased as a long-term store of value, had become worthless overnight when flood insurance was canceled due to unacceptable climate risk. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who understood global economic patterns better than almost anyone had failed to see the climate threat to his own investments. The morning that Bridgewater's agricultural portfolio lost $80 million in a single day, Ray had called an emergency meeting with his entire research team. The conference room fell silent as they presented their findings. Climate change wasn't a gradual risk that markets could price and adapt to. It was a cascade of accelerating feedback loops that would overwhelm the economic system's ability to respond. Ray's team had initially attributed these losses to normal market fluctuations, but the pattern was too consistent and too widespread. When they began incorporating real-time climate data into their economic models, the results were apocalyptic. The global economy was heading toward a collision with physical reality that would make previous financial crises look like minor corrections. The data painted a terrifying picture of economic disintegration. Rising temperatures weren't just changing weather patterns, they were systematically destroying the infrastructure that capitalism depended on. Agricultural yields were collapsing in regions that fed billions of people. Coastal cities that generated trillions in economic activity were becoming uninsurable due to sea level rise. Energy grids were failing under the strain of extreme weather, making industrial production unreliable. Ray had documented specific case studies that kept him awake at night. Miami's commercial real estate market was in free fall as buyers realized that luxury condominiums would be underwater within decades. California's agricultural sector was hemorrhaging money as water rights became more expensive than the crops they produced. Texas energy companies were spending more on infrastructure hardening than they earned from power generation. But the most devastating finding was the feedback loop Ray had identified between climate change and economic inequality. As basic necessities like food and water became scarce, their prices were rising exponentially. The middle class was being priced out of survival itself, creating social instability that was making long-term investment impossible. Ray's own family was feeling the impact. His daughter Sarah, who lived in Phoenix, had seen her home's value drop by 40% as the city became essentially unlivable during summer months. His son Michael's organic farming operation in Vermont was failing as unpredictable weather made crop planting impossible. These weren't abstract economic scenarios. They were personal disasters happening to people Ray loved. Ray walked to his office window, looking out at the Connecticut landscape that had been transformed by 3 consecutive years of extreme weather. The economic implications of what he was seeing went beyond recession or depression. This was about the fundamental viability of an economic system that assumed infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. Bridgewater managed money for pension funds, university endowments, and sovereign wealth funds that represented millions of people's life savings. Ray's fiduciary responsibility was to preserve and grow that wealth, but his analysis showed that preservation itself might be impossible in a climate-destabilized world. Ray returned to his desk and opened the most disturbing section of his analysis, the timeline for economic collapse. According to his models, the point of no return would arrive in 2030, just 5 years away. After that date, climate change would make capitalism economically unviable, as the costs of maintaining basic infrastructure would exceed the wealth that economic activity could generate. The mathematics were inexorable. Every economic model Ray had tested showed the same result. When the cost of adapting to climate change exceeded the profits generated by economic growth, capitalism would enter terminal decline. Insurance markets would collapse first, followed by agricultural systems, then energy infrastructure, and finally the financial institutions that depended on stable long-term returns. Ray had documented specific examples of how this collapse was already beginning. Lloyd's of London was quietly withdrawing from flood insurance markets across the American Southeast. Agricultural banks in the Midwest were recording massive losses as corn and soybean yields fell below profitable levels. Energy companies were spending more on climate adaptation than they were earning from power generation. The human cost was already becoming apparent in food prices. Ray's analysis showed that basic nutrition was becoming unaffordable for increasing numbers of people worldwide. When people couldn't afford food, they couldn't participate in consumer markets. When consumer markets collapsed, the entire capitalist system would follow. Ray's research revealed that food prices had increased by 300% in climate-vulnerable regions over the past 2 years. Middle-class families in Texas were choosing between air conditioning and groceries during heat waves. European households were rationing protein as agricultural yields declined across the continent. These weren't temporary adjustments, they were permanent shifts toward a world where basic survival consumed most people's income. Ray's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unexpected source. Ray, urgent. We discuss climate economic implications for global stability. Time sensitive. Mere Jerome Powell. Federal Reserve Chairman Powell calling at 3:30 a.m. meant this had already escalated to the highest levels of American economic policy. Ray dialed the secure number immediately. Jerome, I assume this is about the climate economic modeling. Ray, we need your assessment of what happens to the American economy if climate change accelerates beyond our adaptation capacity. The president is being briefed tomorrow morning, and we need to understand the systemic implications. Ray felt the weight of the moment. He was being asked to provide analysis that would influence American policy during the most significant economic threat in human history. Jerome, my analysis suggests we're looking at the end of capitalism as we know it. When the cost of climate adaptation exceeds economic productivity, the entire system becomes unsustainable. We're not talking about recession, we're talking about economic physics. Ray, what's the timeline for this scenario? 5 years. By 2030, climate change will make traditional capitalism economically impossible. The infrastructure costs alone will bankrupt most developed nations. And the scale of the impact? $200 trillion in global assets will become stranded investments. Every economic sector that depends on stable climate conditions will face permanent contraction. Jerome, we're talking about the greatest wealth destruction in human history. Ray elaborated on his most concerning finding. Jerome, the climate crisis isn't just an environmental problem. It's revealing that capitalism's assumption of infinite growth on a finite planet is mathematically impossible. When physical reality imposes hard limits, economic theory becomes irrelevant. Ray, are you suggesting that climate change will force us to abandon free market economics entirely? I'm suggesting that free market economics only works when markets can externalize environmental costs. When those costs come due all at once, the entire system becomes uneconomical. We're about to discover whether human civilization can develop an economic system that operates within planetary boundaries. Ray, what about technological solutions? Can't innovation solve these problems? Jerome, I've analyzed every proposed technological solution. Solar panels and electric vehicles help at the margins, but they can't overcome the fundamental physics of ecological collapse. When agricultural systems fail and coastal cities flood, technology becomes irrelevant. You can't innovate your way out of starvation. After ending the call, Ray sat alone in his office, grappling with the implications of what he had told the Federal Reserve chairman. He wasn't just analyzing market conditions anymore. He was documenting the end of the economic system that had defined human civilization for the past 3 centuries. Ray's computer chimed with an urgent message from his European research team. Ray, new data from reinsurance markets shows accelerated withdrawal from climate-exposed regions. Munich. Ray calling emergency meeting about systemic insurance failure. Need your economic impact assessment immediately. Ray realized his analysis wasn't academic anymore. The climate economic crisis was accelerating faster than his models had predicted, and the world's largest financial institutions were quietly preparing for economic collapse that most people didn't even know was coming. The insurance industry's quiet panic was perhaps the most telling indicator Ray had found. Insurance companies were the canaries in the coal mine of climate risk, and they were dying en masse. When insurers couldn't price risk because the risk exceeded their mathematical models, the entire concept of manageable risk became meaningless. The secure phone rang again. This time it was Christine Lagarde from the European Central Bank. Ray, I trust you've seen the latest climate risk assessments from European reinsurance markets. Christine, I'm seeing systematic withdrawal from entire economic sectors. This isn't just market adjustment. It's preparation for economic transformation. Ray, we need to discuss what happens to the European economy when agricultural yields fall below subsistence levels. Our models show potential social collapse within this decade. Christine, what's the European Central Bank's assessment of capitalism's viability under extreme climate change? Ray, we're quietly developing contingency plans for post-capitalist economic structures. When markets can't price climate risk accurately because the risk exceeds the economic system's capacity to respond, traditional monetary policy becomes meaningless. And what about coordination with other central banks? That's why I'm calling. Ray, we need someone with your analytical credibility to help design economic systems that can function within ecological limits. Capitalism served us well, but it's not adapted for survival on a destabilized planet. Christine's tone carried a gravity. that Ray had never heard from a central banker. She was acknowledging that the world's economic leadership was secretly preparing for the end of capitalism itself. Christine, what specific alternatives are central banks considering? Resource-based allocation systems, ecological economics, post-growth frameworks. We're studying indigenous economic systems that sustain populations for thousands of years. Ray, when GDP growth becomes impossible due to ecological constraints, we need economic models that can maintain prosperity without expansion. Ray spent the next 2 hours reviewing his most devastating findings. The climate economic death spiral was accelerating through multiple feedback loops. As agricultural productivity declined, food prices rose, reducing consumer spending and triggering recession. As extreme weather destroyed infrastructure, governments borrowed massive amounts for reconstruction, destabilizing currencies. As insurance markets collapsed, businesses couldn't obtain coverage, making investment impossible. The psychological impact was equally destructive. When people realized that capitalism couldn't guarantee their basic survival, they stopped participating in consumer markets. When consumer confidence collapsed, the economic growth that capitalism required became impossible to achieve. Ray's most disturbing discovery was that the climate crisis was exposing capitalism's fundamental logical contradiction. The system required infinite growth on a finite planet, but infinite growth was physically impossible. Climate change was simply the mechanism by which that contradiction was resolving itself through systemic collapse. Ray opened a new document and began writing what he knew would be the most controversial economic analysis of his career: The Climate Capitalism Death Spiral: Why Economic Growth Cannot Survive Ecological Collapse. But as he began typing, Ray realized the fundamental contradiction in his position. How could he advise clients to invest in an economic system that his own analysis showed was heading toward extinction? How could Bridgewater continue managing assets for long-term growth when long-term growth was becoming physically impossible? Ray's personal investment philosophy was built on the principle that markets would always find ways to grow and adapt. But climate change was imposing hard physical limits that no amount of innovation or adaptation could overcome. There wasn't enough time, money, or technology to prevent economic collapse. The secure phone buzzed with a message that crystallized his dilemma. Ray need immediate strategy for Bridgewater's climate-exposed assets. Clients asking about moving to climate-proof investments, but your analysis suggests no safe assets exist. How do we preserve wealth during economic system collapse? Ray stared at the message, understanding that this was the moment when his theoretical analysis became a practical existential crisis. If capitalism was ending, what was the point of investment management? If money itself was becoming worthless, how could he continue managing other people's wealth? The tragic irony was that Bridgewater's clients, pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, represented the life savings of millions of ordinary people who trusted that the economic system would provide for their retirements and their children's educations. But Ray's analysis showed that system was about to collapse under the weight of physical reality. Ray walked back to his window and watched another extreme weather event developing on the horizon. Somewhere in agricultural regions across the world, crops were failing due to unprecedented heat. In coastal cities, infrastructure was being destroyed by storms that exceeded all historical precedents. In corporate boardrooms, executives were making decisions based on quarterly profits while ignoring the climate crisis that would make their companies irrelevant. The irony wasn't lost on Ray that capitalism's greatest strength, its ability to optimize for short-term profits, had become its fatal weakness in the face of long-term climate change. The system that had created unprecedented wealth was now destroying the planet that wealth depended on. Ray's analysis showed that the transition period would be the most dangerous time in human history, as the old economic system collapsed, but before new systems could establish themselves, billions of people would be left without economic security. The potential for social collapse, resource wars, and civilizational breakdown was enormous. Ray's secure phone rang one final time. It was Greta Thunberg. "Mr. Dalio, I understand you've reached some conclusions about capitalism and climate change that align with what young people have been saying for years." Ray was surprised by the call, but not by the message. "Greta, my economic analysis confirms what climate science has been showing. Capitalism cannot survive on a destabilized planet. Mr. Dalio, the question is what we do with that information. Do we continue pretending that minor reforms can save a system that's fundamentally incompatible with planetary boundaries, or do we start designing economic alternatives?" Greta, what kind of economic alternatives are you envisioning? Economic systems that prioritize survival over profit, cooperation over competition, and ecological stability over growth. Mr. Dalio, you have the credibility to help people understand that we're not choosing between capitalism and socialism. We're choosing between economic transformation and civilizational collapse. And what role do you see for someone like me in that transformation? Help people understand that fighting climate change isn't anti-business, it's pro-survival. The economy can't function on a dead planet, and the planet can't survive an economy that treats it as an infinite resource. Greta, but how do we transition without causing massive suffering for the billions of people who depend on the current system? Mr. Dalio, massive suffering is guaranteed if we don't transition. Climate change will cause far more suffering than economic transformation. The question is whether we choose managed transition or chaotic collapse. After ending the call, Ray sat in his office as dawn broke over Connecticut. The climate economic crisis wasn't a future possibility. It was a present reality that most people were still trying to ignore. The question wasn't whether capitalism would survive climate change, but whether human civilization would survive the transition to whatever economic system replaced it. Ray made his decision. He would publish his analysis and use Bridgewater's influence to help design economic systems that could operate within ecological limits. It would mean abandoning the investment philosophy that had made him one of the world's most successful investors, but it might help humanity develop an economy that could actually sustain human civilization. As Ray prepared to write the most important economic manifesto of his career, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was documenting not just the end of capitalism, but the beginning of humanity's greatest challenge, learning to live prosperously on a planet with finite resources. The $200 trillion question wasn't whether the economy would collapse, but whether humanity could build something better from the ruins. Ray Dalio was about to find out whether the species that had created capitalism was wise enough to transcend it before it destroyed them all.